I never thought the night sky could save me, but after Dad passed away, I left Chicago and moved into a small wooden cabin in Oregon, hoping the silence would fix the pieces of me that grief had shattered. And most nights I sat on the rooftop, with my old DSLR camera, chasing constellations like someone searching for lost memories. The stars burning quietly above like reminders that life continues even when you feel stuck. And that's when I found her, not in person, not in some unexpected twist of fate on a random street corner, but online, through a small stargazing forum called Cosmos Connect, where strangers shared pictures of the night sky. I had uploaded a blurry shot of Orion's belt, frustrated at my poor focus, when a reply came almost instantly. "You framed it wrong. Tilt 30 degrees north. Trust me, Orion will thank you." I stared at the message, smiled for the first time in weeks, and typed back, "And you are." To which she replied, "Luna, not my real name. Just someone who prefers looking up." And over the next few days, Luna became Sophie, a 24-year-old astronomy student living in Vermont, 2,800 miles away from me, and yet somehow closer than anyone had been in years. She sent me her first photo of the moon through an old university telescope, slightly blurred but strangely alive, and captioned it, "This is the only thing we both see the same way." And that single line rewired something inside me, because that night I tilted my lens to match hers, and for the first time since losing Dad, I didn't feel so alone. Days turned into weeks, and nights turned into months, and we started talking endlessly. First about meteors, eclipses, galaxies, then about fears, childhood scars, favorite songs, heartbreaks we'd never told anyone about, and somewhere between those late-night calls and silent stargazing sessions, she became the person I couldn't stop waiting for. One evening, while we were both watching the same crescent moon from two different coasts, she whispered softly, "Do you ever think about how many people are staring at this same sky right now?" And I replied, barely breathing, "Yeah, but I only care about the one staring back." And there was silence, the kind that means everything, before she said quietly, "Me too." Falling for Sophie was not sudden, it happened quietly, like dusk slipping into night. And before I knew it, she became the rhythm of my days and the reason my nights felt less lonely, our conversations stretching endlessly across time. Zones as though we were trying to outlast distance itself. And I found myself waiting for her texts, like the sky waits for stars, each one carrying fragments of her world that slowly became mine. She'd send me voice notes of Vermont thunderstorms, and I'd send her time-lapses of Oregon sunrises, our lives stitched together through pixels, late-night laughter, and promises whispered across weak signals. And sometimes we'd fall asleep, on video calls, waking up to soft static, pretending we were sharing the same silence even when 2,800 miles of Earth stood between us. I'd teach her long exposure techniques for capturing meteor showers, and she'd tell me stories about ancient constellations passed down from forgotten cultures. And one night, while I photographed the Milky Way spilling like paint across the Oregon sky, she whispered softly, "Do you ever think we found each other by accident?" And I said, "No, Sophie. Some stars are meant to collide." And she didn't reply, just smiled in that way I could hear even without seeing her. But life doesn't pause for love. And when she called me one quiet evening, her voice trembling as she said, "I got it, Eli." The fellowship? I already knew what was coming, because she had spent months applying for an elite astronomy program in Norway, the kind of opportunity people dream of for years. And though my chest tightened, I told her to say yes, because sometimes loving someone means watching them chase the very thing that could take them away. And she asked softly, "But what about us?" And I forced a smile she couldn't see, whispering, "We'll still have the moon." But even as I said it, I felt the ground beneath us start to shift. She left for Norway in September, and suddenly our conversations became fragmented, swallowed by time zones and exhaustion, our calls shorter, our silences longer, and slowly, The laughter faded into updates you could fit in bullet points. I kept photographing skies we no longer watched together, and she kept sending me images of auroras from halfway across the world, and yet I could feel her slipping away like stardust through my fingers. One night, I stayed up waiting for her call, scrolling through our old messages, when I stumbled upon her latest post on the Cosmos Connect forum, the place where we first met. It said, "Sometimes love can't survive gravity," and I stared at the screen for hours, unable to breathe, unable to type, because there was nothing left to say. We didn't break up, not officially. We just stopped calling the same place home. And for the first time in months, I stopped looking up at the night sky because I couldn't stand the thought of us staring at the same moon, pretending we were still okay. Arizona smelled like dust and electricity the night I drove into the high desert. A ridgeline of black rock cutting a clean horizon where the sky could stage its quiet miracle. And I told myself this was just an assignment. Set the tripod, meter the light, bracket exposures, until the wind carried a voice I hadn't heard in a year, and my body knew it before my mind caught up. "You're late," she said, almost laughing, and I turned to see Sophie standing 10 feet away with a camera around her neck and hair a little shorter, eyes a little brighter, like the year had sanded her down to something truer. And all I could manage was, "Hey, Luna," because some names live where the heart keeps a spare key. We didn't rush toward each other or stage a movie kiss. We just moved closer in the way gravity solves a math problem, setting gears side by side, checking the path of shadow across the moon's face while our hands found their old conversation. "You still shoot manual. Always. You still overexposed by a third when you're scared. Don't tell on me." And the first bite of Earth's shadow made a neat crescent that turned the night into a clock we could finally read. We didn't talk about Norway at first, or about how we broke without breaking. We let the desert do the heavy lifting, the coyote yipping somewhere below, the creosote waking a green scent after a phantom rain, the faint chatter of other scopes on the ridge. And then, softly, she said, "I wrote that post to convince myself," and I said, "I read it like a goodbye I deserved," and she shook her head fast, once, like she could throw the year off her shoulders. "No, Eli, you didn't deserve it." I was drowning in sleep I couldn't have and light I couldn't miss, and I thought naming it physics would hurt less. And I told her the truth I had been storing like film in a dark canister. I stopped looking up for a while, and she flinched like I'd confessed a kindness I shouldn't have had to give. The shadow kept eating the moon. Our shutters began their patient rhythm. 2 seconds, 4, 8, intervalometers ticking like small hearts. And I counted in my head the way Dad taught me to slow time when I was a kid. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, until totality slid over us and the moon went blood dark, a floating ember, and something inside me that had been clenched for months finally let go. We stood shoulder to shoulder without touching, because some prayers require space, and watched it hang there, dim, red, impossible. And I felt the exact size of the distance we had survived and the size of the room it had left in me. When she finally took my hand, it was not dramatic, it was practical, like calibrating a mount. Small pressure, precise, enough. And she whispered, "I kept trying to send you pictures, the color never matched what I felt." And I said, I kept writing. "You messages, the words never matched what I meant." And we both laughed in that broken fixed way that means the truth landed. Totality slipped, light returning at the edge like someone lifting a curtain a little at a time. And I knew the night was giving us a clean seam to tuck our story into, not to hide it, but to keep it from unraveling. We packed slowly, in sync, the way old partners forget they learned, wiping dust from lenses, wrapping cables, letting silence make the apex arguments we used to chase. And then she said the thing people only say when they've learned not to bargain with fate. "I'm being considered for an instrumentation post at an observatory. Could be Mauna Kea, could be Atacama. It's everything I ever wanted, and it scares me because it doesn't leave room." And I told her the risk I'd been afraid to say out loud. "I'm moving my studio to Portland, trying to shoot more work that isn't for anyone but me. Trying to be a person who makes room. And we stood there with the kind of math you can't solve. Two vectors aimed true in different directions. And instead of pretending to choose, we chose honesty. We drove to a 24-hour diner with chrome stools and a waitress who called everyone honey and split a plate of eggs at 2:13 a.m. And the fluorescent lights didn't make anything uglier. They just told the truth louder. So we talked the way people talk when the night knows their names. She told me the aurora made her cry in Norway, not because it was beautiful, but because it kept going when she wanted it to wait for her. I told her I missed Dad most in grocery stores because he whistled without noticing, and silence is worst between cereal and dish soap. And somewhere between refills, she pulled a pen from behind her ear and took my hand and wrote a date 5 years from now and a time under it. Next total lunar eclipse visible to both hemispheres, she said. No promises about where. Only that we stand under it if we can stand at all. And the numbers on my skin looked like coordinates for a life I didn't have to force. Outside the diner, the air was colder. The sky a cheap black velvet with a few tourist stars glued on. And we stood by our cars like kids after curfew, knowing goodbye was a kind of discipline. And she unclipped a tiny enamel moon from her camera strap and pinned it to mine. So your gear knows it's been blessed, she joked. And I pulled a small lens cloth from my bag, the one I'd stitched clumsily with a crescent when I was teaching myself to mend instead of replace, and pressed it into her palm for the nights the dust wins. And we both smiled because dust always wins, and so do people who keep cleaning. The hug wasn't a compromise, it was a treaty. Warm, careful, long enough to register but not long enough to lie. And when she stepped back, she said, "We were good, you know." And I nodded. We didn't fail. We rerouted. And that felt like the most adult sentence I'd ever said. She drove toward the black ribbon of highway and I watched her taillights until they turned into a pair of traveling stars. Then I turned the other way and let the desert take me back to the ridge for one last look, lifting the camera without shooting because sometimes the absence is the photograph. And the moon sat there ordinary again, pale and forgiven. And I tucked my hand into my jacket to smudge the drying ink so it would stain a little. A quiet contract, a future written where a pulse keeps time. Back at the motel, I downloaded the night's frames and didn't touch them. Just watched the thumbnails populate. Dark, lighter, dark, red, like a heart learning the beat it forgot. And I slept without dreaming. Or maybe I dreamed without noticing, which is its own mercy. At sunrise, I drove west. Windows down, radio low, the enamel moon on my strap clicking softly like a metronome for a song I hadn't written. And for the first time since losing her, I looked up at a morning sky and didn't ask it to answer anything, just let it be wide, let it be blue, let it be shared. 5 months after Arizona, the world started moving again, but slower this time, softer, like the universe had finally stopped yelling and started listening. I moved to Portland, just as the first autumn rain stained the sidewalks darker, renting a loft above a dusty cafe where the smell of burnt espresso lived in the walls. And I filled the space with frames of skies I had chased and lost and almost ruined. And I told myself this was healing by, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet sort that creeps in while you're doing dishes or standing in line for milk. Some mornings I'd take the train out past the bridges and sit by the Willamette River, setting up my camera for no one but me, and the city kept offering me its small kindnesses. A seagull landing exactly in frame, a stranger handing me a cup of black coffee, an old man humming Sinatra under his breath. And I started to believe life wasn't punishing me for letting go, it was rewarding me for carrying on. Sophie and I didn't talk often after that night in Arizona, but every now and then an email would arrive without a greeting or signature. Just a single photo, her shadow on snow, a mountain cutting the sky, an empty observatory dome at dawn. And I'd reply with something equally unspoken. A picture of wet asphalt reflecting city lights, or a long exposure of star trails vanishing into black. And it wasn't closure. Pai, it was continuity. 2 parallel lines that stopped pretending they'd ever intersect, but learned to run steady. In the loft, I started teaching small weekend workshops for beginner photographers, and one rainy Saturday, a student asked, "Why do you shoot the sky so much?" And I said without thinking, "Because it reminds me of someone who taught me to look up." And the words sat there in the room like an echo we could all feel, even the shy kid in the back nodding like he'd just found permission to miss. Someone too. Ava came to visit one weekend, the kind of friend who remembers who you were before you were broken, and she noticed the tiny enamel moon still clipped to my camera strap. "You still carry her, huh?" she said gently, and I smiled without apology. "Yeah, but it's lighter now." And she squeezed my shoulder the way only someone who's known all your versions can, and we spent the afternoon rearranging my prints for a small gallery show. I'd been asked to host, the first one under my name instead of a magazine's, and opening night came faster than I was ready for. The gallery was a small, renovated bookstore, warm lights hanging low, soft jazz threading through air, thick with the smell of paper and possibility. And I watched strangers stand in front of my frames like they were looking through windows into my memory. One photograph drew them in more than the rest. The sequence from Arizona, the blood-red moon in full totality glowing over the desert ridge. And someone asked, "What were you thinking when you shot this?" And I said quietly, "That some people are worth orbiting, even if you never land," and they smiled without asking for more. After everyone left, I sat on the floor between stacks of unsold books and let the quiet come back, and that's when my phone buzzed. A simple notification from Sophie, no words, just a link to a live stream. Mauna Kea Observatory, clouds rolling. Fast, lens trained on a starfield. No city light could drown, and beneath it, a timestamp for a meteor shower about to peak. I clicked without replying, full screen glowing on my laptop, and watched the sky bloom white streaks across black, knowing she was watching from the other side of the ocean. And for a moment it felt exactly like the first time she sent me the moon, like the universe had folded itself small enough for two people to share without touching. Months blurred into a rhythm. Workshops, galleries, long drives through Oregon fog chasing storms, replying to Sophie's emails without needing sentences. And somewhere in there the ache softened, like the tide sanding sharp rocks down to something you could carry without bleeding. On a cold winter night while editing prints, I opened my old leather notebook and found the fading ink she had written on my hand in that diner, the date of the next total lunar eclipse visible from both hemispheres. And I stared at the numbers, for a long time, tracing them like a map to a place where time is patient. And now, 5 years later, here I am, sitting on a grassy cliff in Iceland under a sky so clear it feels impossible. My camera set, the enamel moon still on my strap, the wind sharp enough to taste, the world waiting to turn red again. People are gathered all around me, murmuring softly like the earth itself is holding its breath. And I don't know where Sophie is. Maybe Atacama, maybe Mauna Kea, maybe standing barefoot on some quiet Vermont hill. But I know she's out. There, and when the shadow slips over the edge of the moon and it begins to glow like a secret held too long, I look up and whisper the promise we never stopped keeping. No matter where we are, we're still under the same moon.